First thing I'm going to ask you to do is to make sure you turn off your electronic devices. VACO is taping this session, so please hold the chatter down between your seatmates and listen to the individuals up here so the camera can pick up what they're saying. Good morning. My name is Bill Robertson. I'm on the Board of Supervisors of Prince George County, and I'm also chairman of the VACO Steering Committee on Compensation and Retirement. Thank you for being here with us this morning to discuss this very important matter of $15.2 billion, the unfunded teacher pension liability challenge. As most of you know, GASB 68 is what we're getting forward to. Ensuring that the state and localities remain partners in sharing proportional responsibility for the unfunded teacher pension liability of $15.2 billion is a key priority for VACO because the apportionment of 100% of this liability to localities will damage the long-term credit worthiness of Virginia's localities and hurt economic development efforts at the local level. This challenge also would place a financial liability on localities for which the state drives the funding decisions and the plan composition. I can tell you that VACO and a working group of counties has spearheaded efforts to partner with Virginia Municipal League and the Governor's Task Force for Local Government Mandate Review in working on this issue over the past year, and we will get the facts out to everybody as to what's going on and what we're trying to do. Basically, we're trying to stress the commitment of the counties to taking their portion of the responsibility, which is about 2/3 of the total liability. We are fortunate to have two excellent speakers with us here today. We will take questions as a panel after both speakers have presented. Today, we will hear from Delegate Steve Landis, who will give us an overview of the pension issues that face the General Assembly and current challenges and possible solutions to the unfunded mandate issue, unfunded liability issue. As a local, mandate's on my mind. Yes. First, though, we will hear from Joe Casey, who is Deputy Manager of Henrico County, who will provide an overview of the challenges facing localities with this issue. Mr. Joe Casey. He came to Henrico about a year ago from Hanover County. He has served as Deputy County Manager in Henrico since January of this year. He serves on the VACO Compensation and Retirement Steering Committee and is also one of the small group that's working with VML to work our issues out there. He is recognized as a leading public administrator on finance and economic development issues. He recently was called to provide an expert testimony to the unfunded teacher pension liability issue before the Governor's Task Force on Local Mandate Review. Previously, he served as Deputy County Administrator for Hanover from 2004 to 2013 and as their Director of Finance from 1990 to 2004. During his career with Hanover, Hanover had the distinction of being the smallest populated AAA rated bond county in the United States. He previously worked with KMPG, or make that KPMG, and still retains his CPA license. From 1998 to 2007, he also served as an adjunct professor for Virginia Commonwealth University's Graduate Public Education Program, and beginning in 2013, served as a similar adjunct professor with Virginia Tech. He received his undergraduate degree from the University of Richmond in 1986, a graduate degree in public administration from VCU in 1995, and is expected to receive his PhD in public policy at VCU in 2013. Joe currently serves as the Virginia Local Government Managers Association Executive Board and has previously served on the National Government Finance Officers Association Executive Board and is past president of that association. Joe and his wife Suzanne have 3 boys and live in Mechanicsville, Virginia. Joe?
Well, thank you. And sorry for the long introduction.
introduction, but I think my resume was just updated back in January this last year, so it may just be a byproduct of a recent resume. Well, welcome. And again, what I'm trying to do is just try and present a different philosophical approach to this teacher pension liability that's before us. You know, why are we here? You know, and I think that's an important consideration. This GASB 68, and for those that don't know, GASB is the Government Accounting Standards Board, a national entity, regulatory authority. Our auditors, external auditors, need to follow in production of our annual financial statements. But again, I'm trying to recognize that this liability is something that's a topic not just facing Virginia, but the rest of the country. It's not just affecting local governments, it's affecting states. From my CPA hat, it's probably a good thing because it recognizes these pension liabilities that have been more described in our footnotes to financial statements and words, and really quantifying them as a number within our balance sheet. So part of what we're here is you know, now that we know it's before us, what are we going to try and do? Because this proverbial kick the can and having a liability being passed down to another generation is a topic of concern for many people in many facets, private and public sector. But what I'm trying to do and present today is that while the accounting exercise itself makes sense maybe from a state's perspective that its balance sheet can be better by not having a liability, the fact of the matter is with the local liabilities bestowed upon them as a result of GASB 68, we may be in jeopardy, and I don't know that, but it's a philosophical point, jeopardy of losing our bond ratings, or going down a notch or so, or getting negative outlooks. And the question that I'm trying to put before us is, if the state of Virginia, with its strength and its power of its balance sheet, can survive from a bond rating perspective and an economic development perspective, the local governments may be more adverse to it. What's collectively best for the team in the state of Virginia? So again, how do we get here? You know, I'm not going to get into the quantitative aspects of the actuarial result, but as you know, the investment returns of the VRS portfolio have decreased during the recession, as well as some more conservative assumptions into that calculation. So, and hence a liabilities before the VRS portfolio. The actuary, not just for the state report for teacher pensions, but also all of our local government plans, for the most part, have also faced an unfunded liability. Now again, you know, the state, what's confusing to this topic to many people is that what I'm talking about is just a liability part of the equation. The cost of who pays for the VRS rate or rate increases going forward in the future, that's in essence been settled pretty much between, you know, how much the state is contributing towards the teacher cost of pensions and what our local government's going to be paying. Who records the liability does not change the state of Virginia's budget. Who records the liability does not change the local government's budget, nor the school board's budget. This is a classification of a liability, and until that liability goes away, it is solely a balance sheet transaction, not an income statement transaction. Well, one of the changes that happened over the last 10 or 15 years is that as the actuary produced results for the state to consider, or to the VRS board, which again then made recommendations to the state about what the VRS rate should be for the teacher pension plan, the blue line is what the actuary had set. And then it's, you know, it's all quantified based upon the assumptions in it. The state of Virginia, in many cases, chose a lesser funding rate. That decision was based upon means by which maybe they could pay for it or other means, but that was a state decision. As you know, that local governments, whatever the blue line is of the actuary request or recommendation, the VRS board recommends, and again, in essence, we have to pay that. We as local governments do not have the option to select the line below the blue line. And again, you know, the financial person in me says the blue line is the appropriate line, because that is what you need to pay, then you need to start paying it, because what has resulted for the teacher pension plan that's different than the local plan is that the variance between the blue line and the yellow line there has caused, in essence, a higher liability to be incurred because of it. Because again, the blue line has to be higher the next reporting period to catch up for the lower yellow line from a prior period. I'm not going to get into all of this, but this is in essence the rate setting that's been done by the General Assembly in essence for the cost of it. The funding for this is going to be a 24% higher VRS rate over this next 2-year period. And again, you see the proportional funding of that. That's the funding of the VRS program. Local governments collectively will be paying 63% or $128 million. The state of Virginia will be paying 37% or $75 million. Again, that's all being budgeted for. That's the budgets that we're going to have to do as part of balanced budgets. It's part of the budgets that the state will be doing. The impact to it is a great impact. And again, I think that the average impact per teacher, just on the rate change, is about $1,300. And again, my rough math says that's equivalent to what a raise otherwise would have been or could have been for a teacher. So we may need to forego another year or two of raises for teachers. And again, that's our own decisions as local governments in trying to balance to it. To the state's credit, the actions that the General Assembly did take in this last session have put them on a path to get that blue line and yellow line converging together. It will be painful from a cost standpoint, both for the state and the local governments, but again, probably I think by 2020, we will be in essence the benchmark, if you will, of a good pension system, a good funded pension system. What you see here is, again, the unfunded ratio. And this is a term and a statistic that you're going to hear more and more of. The red line, if you will, from actuaries, generally 80% as far as your funded percentage of your liability is considered a good standard. So everything above that red dotted line is considered a strong pension plan. And you see the state of Virginia, pretty much 2009 or so prior, for local governments that is, was above the line. And even for the state of Virginia's teacher pension, 2005 and prior, that was also above the line. Again, if you remember that blue and yellow lines I showed you a few slides ago, that differential that the state chose on that path contributed to the blue line falling at a faster rate than the green bar. But again, local government's also in this position of a challenge of having its green bar, if you will, be below the red line. So who should record the liability? Again, from a local government perspective, we're not saying that the state should pick up 100% of the teacher pension liability. We say that there's a proportional share. And in fact, GASB and Moody's have recognized what they call this cost-sharing way in which pension liabilities could be recorded. If again, two people are contributing to a cause, then the two people bear a responsibility to the outcome of that cause or the disclosure of it. So again, using the funding, if you will, of the VRS teacher system, it is a 63% local government topic and a 37% state topic. And as far as the administration of it, auditors and accountants have said if the state of Virginia were simply administratively to make the payment directly to VRS of its 37% share, then from an auditing perspective and disclosure, then they could show that liability on its financial statements. Again, it's not changing what the state pays as a total cost or contributing to it. It just shows you the differential of the liability. The state's perspective right now, at least, is that local governments pick up 100% of the liability. And if I was Secretary Rick Brown, I would probably make that same comment or preference if I'm trying to make the state's balance sheet be in the best fiscal position. So I don't fault him for that opinion, but what I'm trying to do is represent, again, we as a team in Virginia are not just a state, nor are we just local governments, but we are a team as we're trying to position the state of Virginia collectively to look its best. Here's an example from fiscal year 11. And again, I don't have current statistics, but again, it's one of these exercises I hope that we do get more and more current statistics and analysis. What you see are the dots amongst all the cities and counties in Virginia of where their local government unfunded or funded ratio is. And again, the average is about 80% throughout the state. So that's actually considered a healthy, going back to that line you saw before. Fitch Ratings has sort of this floor, if you will. They say 70% and above is sort of what they look at as a benchmark of a good local government or state government. You see the red dot there? That's a 66% ratio of the funded ratio for the teacher plan. It's below the line. It's below the Fitch line. And actually the 66% from FY11 is actually 62% now. So one of my perspectives I'm trying to offer is if I have to record on my balance sheet this liability, and teachers, I believe, are about 62% of the workforce of local government, that 62% share is such a large population, it will pull down the average, if you will, that you saw above of that red line to that green diamond, which means all of us collectively on average will be below the Fitch standard as far as a benchmark. Then there could be adverse effects from that from a bond rating perspective and our ability to showcase local government. Now, I'm saying this as the state of Virginia. This gives us calm that again, we're not alone in this topic. This is across the country, I think 250 local governments and where they stand in their funded ratio. And again, you see that they're all over the place, but for the most part, Virginia's competing at, if not above them, collectively. So the new paradigm that I'm trying to offer up here is, if the whole of the state, with it in its balance sheet being a better perspective, is greater than the sum of the parts of the local governments, meaning that the state shines better and we as local governments shine a little bit less, is that a good thing for our abilities to jointly work together in trying to recruit businesses as they're coming into the state of Virginia, or trying to retain businesses as they consider growing in the state of Virginia? My rough economic indicators say over these next 2 years, there's a lot of business decisions that are going to be made across this country as we begin this recovery phase or post-recession stage, as businesses figure out where they want to be for the next generation. So to me, collectively, we as a state and local governments together need to figure out how to position Virginia together to best recruit these new businesses and to retain these businesses. And I don't know about your local governments, but the questions you see behind me are generally the questions that we as local officials get asked by many businesses who come knocking on our door or solicit us. They want to know, how good are your schools for the employees' children and maybe future employees, how safe it is for their company and their employees' families, what's the quality of life factors. But many of them also try and use it in the independent verification of your bond rating. That's a third-party assessment of your local government. And I recognize there are many counties in the state of Virginia that may not have bond ratings or current bond ratings because they're not in the debt marketplace. And that's okay, but again, I'm just trying to give a perspective that these filtering questions, you have to answer yes, exclamation point, to many of these things in order to even get an interview with these companies. And we're competing not just with ourselves sometimes, but what I want to try and do is have us compete with the rest of the country and rest of the world to get the best businesses into the state of Virginia. So again, if we are going to possibly get negative outlooks for our bond ratings or downgrades for our bond ratings, the question is then, a fair question to ask is, how does that affect our ability to recruit and retain businesses? So the locality role in this, again, for the most part, if it's small or mid-sized businesses, it's nearly 100% local process to recruit and retain businesses. To the state, to their credit, when it is a larger scale business, they do try and come through the table and help out and offer different types of incentives, and I think that team collaboration has worked very well in Virginia in recruiting some good companies into Virginia. But again, at the end of the day, it's the local government's face, if you will, that this business will see more often. It's the local government's face that's going to have to approve the infrastructure or tax structures to, again, best position the company to make the right decision and the related zonings that go with it. So if we're in it for the jobs, and just use that simple moniker, my personal belief, the answer is yes. I think we have not done what I call an economic development or jobs impact analysis of the liability. It's such an important topic, and unfortunately this topic is rested with the accountants and people who are just in charge of the balance sheet and financial statements of Virginia and the local governments. I'm trying to raise this topic to be much more broader as far as what's going to position Virginia and its local governments to best succeed in recruiting and retaining jobs. So again, if in fact that Virginia is better off as a state with its local governments to have a proportional liability, meaning the state's picking up 37% and the local governments are picking up 63% of it. If we are better as a team in recruiting, retaining businesses from that perspective, it's worth doing that analysis at least. I don't know the results of that analysis. If the results of the analysis show that there is no effect to it, then so be it. But I have not seen good data to indicate that it may be that way. So speaking about local government employees, this is where it gets a little confusing because, teachers, some of them are funded as part of an SOQ formula. We have constitutional officers. We have grant-funded positions. We have a myriad of ways in which we classify employees and their funding source. And again, one of the things I'm trying to do and speak to is, at the end of the day, all of them are local government employees trying to do a good job, whether it's to a student, a citizen, or a business. And again, they just want to serve in that facet. So, this whole teacher classification, the state still does retain a lot of ownership of teachers. It tells us many times what the minimum number of teachers we have. In this last session, it offered up and said, we'll give a 2% matching grades based upon a formula, and it's a use it or lose it. So this is trying to illustrate that there is an ownership interest of the state in our teacher workforce. And at least it's recognizing that we should maybe have a proportional aspect to that. But again, if the state is trying to classify the teachers as a 100% local employee, it raises lots of other questions about our representation of local government and our means and manners by which we can own and operate our shops without the state's input into how we best pay and structure teacher salaries and benefits. And one of them is the VRS board. What you see right behind here is a composite of the state's workforce and local government and teacher workforce as customers of the VRS system. And you see that the state is a 23% slice of the pie. The predominant slice of the pie is local government teachers and again, the local government employees. And again, just to offer a perspective, as a proportional perspective, is that, right on the left-hand side is the composition of the current VRS board. And I'm not here to demean the VRS board. I think they're a very good entity. I think they're good people on it. But they are, in fact, reportable and accountable to the General Assembly and to the governor in the fashion you see on the left. If the VRS board had a proportional element of representation to it, it could be illustrated, and that's just an illustration of what you see on the right-hand side. In fact, even the right-hand side's illustration does favor the state, because it still would be 44% of the board, even though it's only 23% of the employees. Well, getting to the end of this presentation, what you see on the screen here, and it's quite long, but this is the actual wording of the draft legislative agenda that came before the Compensation Committee yesterday. There were some minor tweaks as part of our committee meeting to it, but the intent is still there. And what it's trying to illustrate, and it sounds confusing and complicated, but it's just the whole perspective is it's worth the state considering a proportional sharing of this liability, that it's not only maybe the intent of GASB, but I think it's also the intent of positioning ourselves collectively, state and local governments, to be the best we can in recruiting and retaining businesses, hence through the bond rating aspect. I did an element of this presentation to the Governor's Mandates Commission back in early November, and in fact they actually came out in support of the draft statement. Again, we'll confer with them with whatever final statement existed, but actually on their own accord, they actually mentioned that the VRS board itself may be recognized as an unfunded mandate upon local government because our representation's not there. And if you think about the VRS board, especially as we get into hybrid plans and the ways in which they're going to be holding employees' own monies, and you think about how your deferred compensation programs are, and you have site people coming out and the customer service part of it, there's a lot of customer service involved with 457 and 403B type plans that, again, may be at risk if somebody has to have that service, if you will, performed out of Richmond that may be 300 miles away. Just a quick perspective of the ratings. One of the things that's given rise and making this a higher concern is that Moody's has a proposal to shift the weighted criteria of debt pensions from 10% of their evaluated criteria to 20%. And you see that in the yellow. And the two parts that they're bringing more and more strength to are two ratios that actually many of us probably have never calculated before, but we're going to have to start doing it. And that's your net pension liability to value and your net pension liability to revenue. And you see, based upon the indices, the higher that ratio is, the more impacting it is to your bond rating. But again, I don't know the results of how all of this is going to fare out. And that's why the question marks are there. And I think before we lock into 100% local liability, I would love to have a worksheet that would illustrate what those question marks could be. What are the effects to us about the Moody's criteria? What are the effects of this recordation of this liability? Because it's a direct one-for-one impact to those two net pension liability factors. Here's just an illustrative example of some of the larger governments in Virginia with their liability under the $15.2 billion liability that's being pushed down if it was 100% locally recorded. You do see their bond ratings there, and actually we were able to get a metric as far as 2013 job growth. So again, these larger local governments, right or wrong, actually have been 51% of the state job growth in recent years. All of them have fairly good bond ratings to their credit. All of them may have an impact of a negative outlook or possibly a downgrade in their bond rating because of this net pension liability. And again, I don't know that. It's just the question needs to be asked, and the analysis needs to be further vetted and done on this topic. The Henrico, I just ran through a couple of minor slides and just showing how it pertains to Henrico. This $500 million liability would take the net assets of the schools into a negative position. That's a fact. It would erase the entire, not only make it zero, it would make it negative $260 million. The Henrico balance sheet itself would go from the 1.5 to the 1 that you see there below, a significant impact. The liability per teacher would be $136,000. That is a large, large number. And again, those numbers in the boxes on the right may be similar to your own local governments. Trying to illustrate our debt ratios, and you know, again, the red lines that you see are our debt policies and guidelines that we use. We have not revised our policies to account for what a new red line would be with the net pension liability. But again, it's a topic and a question that we as local governments and the state need to work together. You do see that the liability is double, if you will, our entire gross bonded debt ratio. Now you see on the right-hand side, if the state were to actually have a little bit of a sliver, which is in the yellow, it doesn't necessarily solve all the problems, but it sure makes them a lot more easier to achieve goals and strategies to get there. Debt per capita, another common statistic. You see how far it shoots above with the entire liability in the middle column and the proportional liability on the far right-hand column. The debt to assessed value, another popular indicator of ability to pay off debt. The red lines are capacity, and again, you see that, you know, how far up it goes with the 100%. So again, the question that I'm trying to ask, and I've only started thinking about this in the last month or so, because I feel as though that, you know, I had my CPA hat on too long, or the emotion that I want the best balance sheet possible, but I realized from talking to some businesses, especially prospects, talking to our economic development office, talking to some state economic development people, that our ability collectively to recruit new businesses into Virginia and or have existing businesses want to dig deeper roots may be contingent upon our bond ratings looking as strong as possible, because we have to be competitive together, especially when other states and other local governments across the country may start seeing their bond ratings shine a little bit less. So again, if 100% of the liability recordation is more adverse to economic development and job creation than a proportional liability, you know, why wouldn't the state recognize it? That's a question, and I don't know the answer, but I do believe it's a fair question. Thank you.
Next, we have Delegate Landis with us. I want to thank him very much for taking time out of his busy schedule to be here with us today. Now it is my distinct honor to introduce Delegate Steve Landis, who represents the 25th District of Virginia House of Delegates, which now includes portions of Albemarle, Augusta, and Rockingham County. He is the Vice Chairman of the House Education Committee and a member of the House Appropriations, Rules, Privilege, and Elections Committees. Delegate Landis has been a true friend to counties and true leader so many critical issues facing Virginia, including pension issues. He has led efforts to expand agriculture and forestry operations through grant and loan programs, and introduced legislation creating the Secretary of Agriculture and Forestry as part of the Governor's Cabinet, and legislation establishing the Center for Rural Virginia. Delegate Landis also serves as the House Budget Conferee and is Chairman of the Economic Development, Agriculture, and Natural Resources Subcommittee of the House Appropriations, and Chairman of the Studies Subcommittee of House Rules. From 1988 to 1992, he served as legislative assistant to his predecessor, former Delegate Pete Giesen. And from 1993 to 1995, he served as Congressman Bob Goudelet's District Director and District Representative. Delegate Landis is presently Vice President of Market Development for Blue Ridge Bank, which is headquartered in Luray, Virginia. He is a graduate of Buffalo Gap High School in Augusta County and received a Bachelor of Science degree from Virginia Commonwealth University. He and his wife, Angela, who is an assistant Commonwealth attorney for Augusta County, live in Weir's Cave, Virginia, with their son, Rolf. Thank you for being here today, Delegate.
Well, think you all have learned in your service as members of boards of supervisors, there are no easy issues at the local level, and there are no easy issues at the state level. And this is one of them. I really appreciate Joe's presentation and getting a chance to see from the county's perspective when we look at this issue. From my standpoint, I'm glad to be here and glad to be participating with VACO. I've got members of the Rockingham County Board that are here and the Augusta County Board. And I saw a member of the Albemarle County Board last night. I no longer represent cities. That's been my honor in the past. But now I just represent counties. So I think that gives me hopefully a little bit different perspective in trying to address some of these issues. One of the things about the unfunded liability issue that we're going to have to, I think, the General Assembly and counties and cities, we're going to have to come to some conclusion, as Joe said, what the state can do and what it can't do. And as part of the discussion that we're going to have from the budget standpoint, also before I get into specifics of kind of where the state is related to this issue and where we are going, at least at this point, I think it's also important to note from the budget standpoint, Virginia has some other challenges. This is one of them. The unfunded liability for the VRS system in general is one that the state has a responsibility, just as the localities do. The estimates we have right now is about $322 million that we are going to have to keep on track and fund to make good on what Joe said from the standpoint of meeting that obligation. We also have re-benchmarking. You all deal with that as well. That is going to happen, and we'll know and have that information for the General Assembly session. Inflation is still fairly small compared to inflation in the past, but we don't know what the Fed's going to do in the next 2 years from fiscal policy. We also have the challenges related to, and I know in the next room they're talking about Medicaid expansion and reforms and kind of what is going on with that. That potentially is a cost to the Commonwealth and can impact localities, as you all know as well. We also have the challenge of just providing services as you all do, whether it's public safety, transportation, and those other things, state parks and those other organizations within state government that is our responsibility. So we do have a lot of challenges going into the next biennium. The largest challenge, and this, I think it's good to be talking about how this impacts the economy, Joe, because one of the things that we've seen in our economy is Virginia historically grows coming out of a recessionary period at about 8%. Right now, we're growing at about 4.6%. So we're way below where Virginia has seen, and you all have experienced that in your localities as well. Even though Fairfax and some of the other larger localities are doing fairly well, we're still not where we have been in the past. And that means there are challenges in how we balance our budgets, whether it's local or state, in going forward. I would also say that economic development is and will continue to be important. I know it is for you all, because that is how we can get the additional dollars that you all need to provide services and to the state. And I think there's bipartisan agreement that that is something with the new administration we are going to move forward and work on. And again, I think this is a relevant part of that discussion and debate, and how it's going to impact you all, and how that impacts the state for recruiting and retaining businesses in our communities. And then lastly, I'll say before I get into specifically the unfunded liability issue, is I think from Virginia's standpoint and the General Assembly's standpoint, we also have to deal with the new administration. And we don't know what that is going to entail at this point. And this isn't a partisan comment, but I think we also have to realize that we have a new administration coming in that has little experience. And that's just a fact. It's not a criticism. And so we don't know in the General Assembly how that's going to impact how we deal with some of these budget issues. We don't know who the Secretary of Finance is going to be. We don't know whether our Department of Planning and Budget, who's going to lead that. We don't know who's going to be key in some of these other areas, whether it's healthcare or agriculture or technology. And those are important because that impacts you all and it impacts the state and how we move forward. And we're going to find find those things out, I think, between now and January. And I think we'll all be looking to see who the players are. Now, as you all know, the General Assembly has put an emphasis on trying to deal with VRS and the unfunded liability issues. We made the commitment and started the process, I think, by really passing what I consider some significant reforms. And again, there are lots of different views about those reforms, whether they were good or not. But at least we moved forward and we got consensus within the General Assembly to move those reforms forward and make our system whole going forward. And I think that's the most important thing for local governments, and for the state, and for their employees, is that's a commitment to our employees that there be a retirement system and it be sound. And that's the most important thing, I think, in this discussion we need to remember. So from 2010 to 2012 sessions, we really did work on and make that as an emphasis on the reforms. As you know, with our 2012 reforms, we are making a commitment to transition from policy assumptions traditionally used by the General Assembly, and Joe spelled those out. Sometimes we did better than others. Many times we were below what the VRS Board of Trustees had recommended for the rate. And we're making a commitment that the annual 8% rate of return that the Board of Trustees has dealt with for their policy assumptions. As you know, we're currently at a 7.0 annual rate of return. But if we go to and make that commitment and we move forward as we have this past session, and I believe we will this session as well.
Dave, some of us can't hear it all back. Maybe use a mic or something. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but
That's okay. You can tell that's one of my board members because he had no compunction about making sure people could hear. I'm happy to do that. I'm not sure those mics are on, actually. Joe's got a stronger voice than I do. The other thing I'll tell you is I've gotten older. I do have to look down at these notes, and when you do that, you do speak down into the microphone or away from the microphone, so I apologize for that. But anyway, from the retirement system, the point I was making was that we do want to make the assumption, and the General Assembly will make the commitment to meet the rate that is agreed upon by the Board of Trustees moving forward, and that will correct past problems that we've had. Our staff and the information they provided to me shows that for the board certified rate to be funded for the bienniums, we need to, for state employees for the next biennium, we need to be at 66.0%. For teachers, it would be 69.53%. Then we move forward in 15-16, the biennium after that, it'd be at 78%, a little bit more than that. And for teachers, it's 79, almost 80%. And then for fiscal year 17 and 18, it would be 89%. For teachers, almost 90%. And then by 19, the biennium for 19 and 20, we should be at 100%. That is where we need to be, and that's what the General Assembly has made a commitment to do. Now, I've said that. General Assembly members in the House have 2-year terms, as you all know. Senators have 4-year terms. So a General Assembly can only commit 2 years at a time, because that's just our term of office. Just as you all have commitments for 4 years because of your term of office. But I think going forward, no matter who is in the General Assembly from a budget standpoint, and I know for those of us that are on the budget writing committees, both the House Appropriations and Senate Finance, that's our commitment we're going to continue to make. We can't predict whether we'll be there or not, though. So, when we make these commitments, we try to assure people that at least it's going to be there for 2 years at a time. Now, based on the phase-in schedule, the rates for the teacher program will increase from 11.66% this year to 14.5% in the 2014-2016 biennium. Now, preliminary estimates, according to our staff, is that this will result in increased retirement contributions of approximately $204 million each year for the teacher plan, with approximately $82 million being the state share and $122 million being the locality share. And that's what we're talking about. Now, for financial reporting, and again, I am not the expert on VRS. I I should have said that at the beginning. Chris Jones, who's a friend of mine, was also invited to come. He chairs our compensation and retirement subcommittee, and obviously he's much more adept at this than I, but I had the staff basically give me what they would have provided to him. As you all know, there is a concern, and that's what we're discussing, related to the new financial reporting requirements regarding pension liabilities and the impact on your bond ratings. We've had those discussions at the state level. In fact, I had the opportunity to go with the governor this year to New York to see Moody's, Fitch, and Standard & Poor's. And that was one of the things they asked us, is you have a limited, a term-limited governor, only can serve 4 years. What are you all going to do as members of the legislature related to the commitment for PRS and your unfunded liability? And we assured them, again, that we are going to meet that obligation from the state standpoint. Now, as Joe said, the question is going to be, as we discuss this further, what and if the state can do in assisting the localities. And at this point, it's a good time to start that discussion for a number of reasons. One, both the House Appropriations Committee and the Senate Finance Committee have retreats next week. And this is going to be one of the topics that we're going to be talking about. What are the state's options? What might we do? What might we not be able to do, given those other funding priorities and commitments that the state has? Now, I was glad to hear Joe say in the work group that's been looking at this from your all standpoint, that localities and the state realize that it is a state responsibility and a local government responsibility. The new GASB requirements are things that we're just going to both have to deal with and make sure we account for properly. More importantly, if we want to continue to have the bond rating capability for the Commonwealth and for our localities, and to have the AAA bond ratings and the higher bond ratings, we're going to have to come to a resolution and continue to move forward on the issue. Next week, we're going to hear the Appropriations Committee earlier in the week, and then the Senate Finance Committee later in the week from Secretary Brown. We're also going to hear from Bob Schultz, the Director of VRS, who I always remind people used to be a staff person for the House Appropriations Committee before he went there. But they're going to talk to us about the accounting standards, what GASB is requiring, and what the impact is not only on the state, but also on the locality. So I think the timing for this discussion is a very good one. Now, from my standpoint, what can we do going forward? That's just kind of where the state is, what we've done. And we are having discussions about what we can do and what we can't do. But we've not come to any conclusion at this point. So I want you to know that we haven't closed any doors, but we also know if we were to even do the 37% that Joe mentioned, it would be a big ticket item. I think you all would agree. So where are those funds going to come from if we were to do that? Could we do less, or is there a combination of something that we could do? I like the idea that Joe had about the economic impact. I'd be very interested to see how we can move forward and see what that may be. I represent parts of 3 counties, so obviously I'm very interested as an economic development person who chairs that subcommittee on appropriations to know what is the potential economic impact from the standpoint of how it would affect Augusta, Rockingham, and Albemarle, the areas that I represent parts of. So I think that would be good. Joe covered all the facts and figures very well. I had a lot more information from the standpoint of what our staff provided, and luckily it was the same as what Joe provided. And it's always good when we're starting out on the same page with the same information. As you know, that's not always the case related to how the state and the local governments sometimes provide that information. But with that, I think we want to hear your questions that you might have on what we've talked about and what we've discussed. Again, I think I would conclude by saying I just see this as the start of this process. I don't see it as the conclusion. And I think our staff director, Robert Vaughn, was going to try to sit in on this, but I don't see him. He was going to make sure I didn't say anything that would be committing us to anything. Our staff is very careful about that, and I don't think you would want me to at this point, because we all don't have the full information at this point, knowing what the economic impact is potentially, knowing what those costs are, and I think you all would appreciate that we need to know what the impact is on the rest of the budget, as I began my comments. Education is important, public safety is important, all these things are important that we're partners in, and the teachers and the local employees and their VRS impact is obviously part of that importance. And with that, I will stop, and I also would be remiss if I did not introduce or recognize a new member-elect of the House of Delegates, and that's Terry Austin, who currently serves on the Botetourt Board of Supervisors, and he's back there, and I will be glad to listen to Terry's advice as a board member coming into General Assembly. I appreciate him sitting in on this, and I look forward to working with him. So let's see what questions you all might have, and then I'll let our moderator field the questions, and if you want us to step back up to the podium, we can do that, because apparently this mic works better.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
We're going to ask the questions. If you would come forward to where Ms. Bailey is at, would you raise your hand at Ms. Bailey? So that way we can make sure we can hear it and
Check and see if those mics on. Yeah, just turn on. Yeah.
I got a big voice. I can talk. Can you hear me back there? Steve and Joe, first of all, thank you for the information. This is a big issue. And in the broad sense of things, it's an end-sum game. Because if the state does provide, if we get into the share thing, there's only a limited amount of money that you guys have, so it may come from someplace else. So you have to look at all that. So what is the possibility then of looking at some sort of a proportional share in some game for all of us as counties and cities to be able to afford things like VRS and other things? I mean, maybe in the short term it's somewhat painful, but in the long term, that may be more beneficial for our bond ratings, for our recruitment of industries, and for actually a much cleaner relationship between local and state government. But in doing that, it also would require that the state revisit the taxation issues and get the true taxation reform, because for localities to be able to do that proportional type of, have that kind of relationship with the state, we're going to have the ability to raise the revenue if it costs us more to do that. And that's always that 800-pound gorilla that's standing in the room, or the elephant in the room, whenever we have these discussions. So whatever you guys come up with, realize that we have to have the ability to pay for whatever we got to pay for, and we can't continue to have all this tax reform going on in Virginia on the back of local government without the state helping us out a little bit. So that's my point.
Well, and Joe, you probably are in agreement with him, so it's probably easier for me to try to answer this one. Let me say, and I didn't mention tax reform because that wasn't the topic at hand, but it does have an impact, obviously, and we can't think that it does not. Billy knows, and the members of the boards of supervisors, that I have the privilege of working with the localities that I represent parts of. I've made the commitment that I have no problem looking at machinery and tools, BPOL, but if we do tax reform, we've got to replace that with something that will grow for you all. And that can be a portion of the state income tax, or an additional portion option for the sales tax, or something along those lines. And I'm committed to doing that. But having said that, with the new administration coming in, we'll have to see how ready they are to tackle that issue. As you all know, we've been trying to tackle that issue ever since I've been in the General Assembly, and that'll be going after this year. It's been 18 years. This next term, the end of it, I'll have been there 20 years. Some people say that's 22 years too long. Others say that's okay. But it is disappointing that we've not been able to get consensus on what the alternative would be to allow you all a tax source that would allow localities more flexibility and to grow with the economy. You know, and there are a number of us that would like to see that happen. Whether there be enough of us, that's a whole other thing. And we can do it even in a revenue neutral way that allows you the benefit of the economy growing and the Commonwealth as well. I think also related to tax policy, we need to look at how that obviously relates to the state and whether we're reducing by doing that potential revenues as well. That's one of the things, as I mentioned, the state's economy is not growing as it has been. We're much more diversified, as you all know, with our tax sources, corporate income tax, sales tax, income tax, recordation. We've got the lottery, but that's basically committed to education, except for administrative costs. So we've got other sources that you all don't. I think there's some support to move in that direction, but again, a lot of it's going to be determined by the new administration.
If I could just add one clarification to this, because in all my years of trying to work with budgets and with the state, we all focus on our revenues and expenses, the income statement, if you will, of our budget. This is one of the few topics, if at all, that we are actually talking about the balance sheet and not the income statement. So in many ways, we've already agreed to raise the rates up, 24% impact as a local government impact. In essence, that's the same impact that the state is trying to bear for its teacher share. They're also having to pay 100% for the state employees to get up to a funded ratio desired. No different than us for our own local employees are paying a higher VRS rate to get to a palatable funded ratio. So the cost of this proportional thing is actually zero as far as a new budget. The state budget would not change whether they're proportional or not, nor would the local budget change whether it's proportional or not. It's really an accounting entry that's all it is booking a liability on the balance sheet, and the other side of it is reducing your fund balance, retained earnings, net assets, whatever you call it. The flow of the transaction does not go through a budget process. So it's in my 23 years, it's one of those few topics, if anything, that's balance sheet and not income statement. Income statement is the emotion. Income statement is where you have to have the taxes and the public hearings and balanced budgets on both sides. That this one is something that only those crazy accountants have come up with.
Ms. Bailey?
Thank you both. I'd like to dovetail on Delegate Landis's interest in economic development and also Joe's clarification. This is a balance sheet issue. But when we talk about the bond ratings being impacted all across the state and $15 billion of liability showing up the local government balance sheets and the bond ratings, that does impact the amount by which we can invest, which supports in the infrastructure, the schools, the water, the sewer, those things that are the basis for that economic development, that quality of life, the water and sewer that allows that manufacturing plant to expand or to locate. And that has a connection to the revenue side, particularly for the state, because the state does get the income tax from both the business and the jobs. So it is a connection between the ability of all these local governments to make those bottom line investments that support that growth. With 4.5% growth in the state, if we don't have a lot to give up, of growth to give up. So if we drag that down 0.5%, 1%, then that's going to really have an impact, not only this biennium, but next biennium in terms of our revenue side. And so it does end up showing up down the road in terms of our ability to generate the revenues, to keep things going on both the state and local.
There were two quotes. I didn't read them on the slides, but I think it's important to reiterate, especially since some people walked in, is that the VRS director has said in presentations that this may affect, and I'll say may, our local government bond ratings. And the independent financial advisor to the Mandates Commission, somebody who's not tied into local government, did say, based upon his analysis and his firm's analysis, is that the state can absorb this liability, this proportional share, and it would not hinder the state's bond rating. And again, I can't emphasize enough that the state of Virginia, #1 business friendly, I think an underlying concept of being #1 business friendly is the bond ratings. To Virginia's credit, state and local government, we are the leader in the country with the highest bond ratings, by and far. We have the most counties in Virginia, speaking to this audience, most counties in America with the AAA bond rating.
Next question?
Yes,
Mike.
Andy McCready from Pulaski County. I just wondered, could we get a copy of your presentation? Can you post it somewhere where we could retrieve it?
I'm seeing someone say yes.
It's on the back and we'll post it online as well.
Okay. The next portion of the question is, it seems like just last budget, we had to give a 5% pay raise that then went off to retirement. So now it looks like we're going to have to do yet more. Is this going to be a situation where the General Assembly is going to meet in the beginning of 14? You're going to go through your veto sessions, you're going to go through, and finally about May, you're finally going to tell us what we as a local government magically have to pull off the money tree that we keep around back and fund ours. Is it going to be that quick that we're going to have to respond?
Well, that's a good question. I think we'll have to see with, one, the bond rating agencies how quickly, but my understanding is that the expectation is the unfunded liability, both at the local and the state level, we need to act on that during this session in setting up the funding for the next biennium. Now, as you know, we've got a 2-year budget, so there may be a way to look at different aspects of it and see what the impact is. But that's why, as I mentioned, these retreats that we have, I think people think sometimes we just go and have a meeting so we can just talk to each other. What we really try to look at are the tough issues, and this is going to be one of them. And not only for the state, but for you all, as has been, obviously Joe's clearly detailed. So it's already a discussion topic and will be, and we're trying to get consensus on what we think we can do. The other thing that we have a little bit of a challenge, you all, the nice thing about local governments, the tough thing is you're right there and people see you each and every day, and I've always said I think it's the toughest level of government to serve in. But once you all decide and you get consensus on your board, you direct the executive what to do. We don't direct the executive what to do. And we've got this other body called the Senate of Virginia, and we don't always agree with them. So we've got to get consensus not only in the House of Delegates, we've got to see where the Senate stands on this, and I just don't know. They're going to be having the same discussions next week that we are, so we're going to be looking at what they do, and you all will have representatives there, no doubt, just as you will at our retreat. So we've got to see what that consensus is going to be from their standpoint, and then we really need to find out where the governor-elect is going to be on this issue. It's because we don't act independently. The General Assembly is the only one that can appropriate funds or authorize something like this by the Constitution. But the governor obviously has a say, and his finance people are going to have a lot of input. And in result, he gets the final look at it to say yes or no to what we include in the budget. And then, as you know, we get a second look at it. But it's very hard to override a line item veto, or generally the governor's amendments are pretty well adopted as well. So that's just the additional, the reason sometimes I think people misunderstand why it takes us so long to come up with a resolution on some of these tough issues is just because we've got so many players. Sometimes I wish that I was in local government where I could work with 3 other people and I could get something done pretty quickly. It wouldn't take me as many people to have to deal with simply, but that's just the way it is.
Next question?
I'm just wondering, I'm Fitzgerald Vaughn, Louisiana County Board of Supervisors. I'm just wondering, anywhere along the line, because teaching is such a big part of this, have you all looked at, I know in the past you've offered early retirement, or looked at that as a way to give some kind of relief going forward, since the new employees come in on a different retirement plan, what not be looked at any of that?
perspective, you as local governments, through your school boards, can offer various means and measures to give incentive for somebody to retire. The state doesn't dictate nor control that. Sometimes the state does offer a program through the Virginia retirement system, but again, I'll defer to that VRS board and the state in approving such actions.
You know, the other thing that I think, one of the things that you all have sometimes little control over what the educational system does at the local level. I mean, you have to approve their budgets, but you know, the school board obviously independently decides what those priorities are and where those expenditures are. Sometimes that's good, and sometimes that's not good, depending on who you talk to. But at the state level, we can set certain things. But for instance, re-benchmarking. Re-benchmarking includes all sorts of things that localities, it's not just the counties, but the school boards have done that are priorities for that community that the state has no control of, and that is all figured into the re-benchmarking figures. So we actually get put on the hook for additional dollars for something that we had nothing really and directed them to do. And I know at the local level you all do too, and that's the way our system is. But I think we're, to answer your question a little more directly, I think we're willing to look at other, means to try to, provide incentives. But I will tell you, my experience with, trying to get people out early, we tried that once under the Allen administration, at least from the state standpoint, and it ended up costing us more in the end result, even though it was well intended, than was estimated. So you also have to be very careful about early buyout programs for retirement and the like. And the other thing I think for retirement we've all just got to think about, we're all going to be working longer. Like it or not, eventually the federal government's going to change the retirement age for Social Security and Medicare and all those things. They're just going to have to be fiscally prudent and to make that system work. So most of us, I think, are also going to be working longer. And that's not to say we might not be in the same job for the entire time, but I think you're going to see people retiring at 70 and 75. So that's going to impact our retirement systems too somewhat. And we're trying to figure that out as that evolves as well.
I see some people leaving. Please fill out your evaluation form before you leave. And gentleman behind you, and then your next.
Art Me, Cooper Center, I work in Southwest Park State. I wanted to ask a question that clarified what might be a misunderstanding. The local government share of funding, of course, is mandated. But are you saying that if the state 100% funds its obligation for the next 6 years, that the gap below the 80% recommended funding level will close by 2020? So one could say that the state fully funded its share, that this problem that you've identified with the bond funding will, now I realize 6 years is a long time in economic development, parlance, but in 6 years the problem could go away if the General Assembly will fully fund its share of the obligation. That's correct.
Well, that's what we're discussing. The state is going to make the commitment for state employees. The question is the school teacher employees, which the interpretation from the Secretary of Finance is that's a local responsibility. But it's got to be done, whether we participate or whether the local governments are on the hook. It's all got to be accomplished by that.
But isn't Joe's drawing a distinction between the unfunded liability and the year-to-year funding, aren't you? Did I understand you to say that the state share of the teacher retirement obligation is 100% funded by the state, and what the VRS board recommends for the next 6 years, that gap will close by 2020?
Yeah, I think, one, it's almost impossible to always have a 100% funded ratio. There's many anomalies and actuarial assumptions. I think what the state is trying to do is position it to be a healthy plan, and that's above that 80% criteria that you saw before. Changes in investment rates and other things can sometimes actually make the ratio go above 100%. So that's the first fact. But again, it's going to take us 6 years to go from this 62% funded ratio to what I would call a healthy plan. The state and local governments actually, as it's designed right now in both of our budgets and the budgets that will be before us, have agreed in essence to the expense side of the equation. And again, that's to the state's credit, they're not trying to shift all the
The state
expenses.
has not always funded that recommended level.
No, but it's-
Right.
but
So
it's
that's
right.
what's brought you to where you are.
That's, so the catch-up that we're having over these next 6 years, the higher, and again, this is just the first step. There will be another double-digit increase probably 2 years from now as we position it. But again, I would imagine if you were to look at the state post-2020, you would see hopefully, again, a nominal increase. Plus, again, the changing disposition of who's in the hybrid programs and this or that should also mitigate future impacts.
And Joe, I think, pointed out, the other thing we've got to look at, and this is, looking with trying to have a crystal ball, but not knowing what the economy's going to do. As the economy grows, and say we start growing at 8% again, we would recover more quickly just because the dollars, the investment dollars in the VRS system obviously would perform better than they have in the past 5 or 6 years. So, so Art, that's the other thing that we just don't know. But I don't disagree with anything Joe said from that standpoint.
Based on his question, though, you would still have at an 80% funding level, you would still have 20% that would be carried on balance sheets of either the state or the localities, however it's shared for it forever. Because however the difference between 100%, you still have to carry that. Yes, ma'am.
Doris Lackey from Madison County. When was the last time that we were fully funded at the DRS?
I think from the chart you saw, about 2005 or so was the last time that the teacher plan was. Local governments collectively, I think, made it through 2008, 2009. And again, as the delegate pointed out, the investment portfolio took some tremendous losses during the 3-year period. In fact, the state's 5-year look back as far as investment returns and helping to decide the portfolio or its assumption still is carrying the FY09's 20% loss. So again, in another year, that negative will fall off, and again, we should be positioning the funded ratio to be higher just because of that fact.
But we have to explain to our constituents why this problem occurred. And from all that I understand, it's because the state did not.
Now,
Let me explain that, and you can explain very easily to citizens. As you all did, after the downturn, we had to make cuts. So, now granted, in the past, we had not funded it at the level, but we funded it at a level that actuarially, our internal folks said was accurate or correct. There was a disagreement. Now we're all on the same page. BRS, board, and the General Assembly, and the administration, Republican, Democrat, disagreed on what the rate was. That was part of the problem, because when I first got on the Appropriations Committee, we'd get all this information. BRS said this, the experts internally that dealt with the issue said this, the administration said that, so we tried to basically pick, the General Assembly tried to pick, okay, what's the best rate based on that. Of course, the economy was doing well at that time too, so the system was performing better. But when we did have to, we purposely underfunded, it was because we didn't want to cut education any further. We didn't want to cut public safety any further, and we had to balance it just like you all did. So it was part of the choices we had. And granted, that wasn't a good decision. If we had all the money in the world, we shouldn't have had to do that, but we didn't. And we didn't raise taxes because you don't raise taxes in a down economy. When people are having a hard time making ends meet, and you're having a hard time recruiting businesses and retaining them, that's not the time. You talk to any economist where you go out and say, we're down so far, we're going to go out and get more money. That was just a decision, a political decision that was made, both the administration and the General Assembly. And I don't even think that was partisan. It was just a combination of all those things, and that's the decision we made at that point. There were a lot of things that we did, we corrected when we did that to balance the budget. You've heard of the accelerated sales tax. We've gotten and corrected that to about 98, hopefully with the budget that the governor presents in December, we'll be about 99% and bringing that back. So we've corrected the things, and this is one of those things that we've made the commitment to correct and come back and to do that. So, yeah, we made mistakes, but we're fixing them.
But you're asking us to make up the difference.
No,
you have an obligation. They're your employees, local government employees. What we're debating is the teachers and what we should participate with, I think, because they are shared.
We've been paying our full share all along.
Not of the teachers. The teachers is an agreed upon lower rate that the state selected. So we have not been paying a higher rate of the teachers. It's a share, and that goes back to one of the reasons why we're here. We view it as a shared way in which we've gotten here, and now we're viewing it as a shared way in which we record the liability. Is really the topic at hand. Local plans themselves are not 100% funded either. It's not because we chose a lower rate, but again because of investment performance and other anomalies in the actuarial calculation. So we're still catching up as local governments for a rate that the actuary had recommended. So we're all in this together.
Tell me if I'm wrong, but the main reason we're here today is because the General Assembly has agreed to bring the rates back up, to where we'll get them back up where it's 80% funded or more. But what's happened is over the last few years, many cities and other places have gone bankrupt. And the rating agencies have learned that these pensions are on nobody's balance sheet. So therefore, that's the reason Gatsby 68 is coming out to make these appear on somebody's balance sheet. And the question in Virginia is it all going to be on the localities, or is the state going to take up?
You know, the one thing about this whole issue that I found very interesting is we are on the same page, and it's not, and this issue is not, the Gatsby regulations and rules is not because something the state has dictated or you have dictated or even the federal government has dictated. It is an accounting process and procedure, and it's a standard that we all live by. So, it's the one time that, nobody's at fault from the standpoint of, we can't say it's the locality's fault or it's the state's fault or it's the federal government's fault. It's just the way they calculate it.
Yes, sir. This will be the last question.
Jim Eisner from James City County, and I do appreciate hearing the commitment to deal with it. And I think from what I'm hearing in the discussion up here that the Gatsby rule is very much needed in order to properly accommodate because of the risk involved. I got to tell you that commitment is also one of my concerns is the confidence that our citizens have in our ability to do the job. I come from a little different background. I'm retired. I get about 60 cents on the dollar from my pension because it went belly up. And there are a lot of local governments around, as you mentioned, that are at risk like that. I think what I'm really concerned about is that we have played a little bit of a game with some of the assumptions and some of how we balance the budget. And as you mentioned, the disagreements between what the rate should be from one group to another. So that we've gotten ourselves into a position now that in order to recover, that we at the local government level are going to have to really come up with some more money, one way or the other, whether we do 100% local or whether we do whatever our percentage is. We're going to come up with more money, even if we do it where it protects the bond rating of the state. It will probably affect our bond rating. So that extra money that we're going to have to come up with means now that we can't have that extra money we're going to need for stormwater, or that extra money we're going to need for new schools. We're putting about every year a half a new school up. So the ripple down effect for us is significant. And what I wanted to make the point is that you've got a real tough job because I'm a little cynical about it, having been the victim of it. How do I explain to my constituents that things are going to get better when they see that we have played, and I don't want to say fast and loose, but we have played some essentially definition games with this over the years in order to make our best, to get us through those rough spots at the state level. And it's coming back, the chickens are coming back to roost at the local level, and although we may be better over the next 4 or 5 years at the state level, I don't see us getting better at the local level for a long time. And so I think that goes back to her question of how do we, it's difficult to explain this to our constituents. And the more help we can get from you all at the state level, the better it will be.
Well, and the difficulty I think also is our shared constituents, as you all know, want services, but then they don't want to also pay for them in many cases. And it's the old adage that we all have, but that's why we're all elected. Joe's not elected, but the rest of us, most of us in here, are elected by our constituents. So that's the balance we have to try to provide. And that's why, as Billy said, I'm hoping that we'll get back to looking at tax reform that can help you all long term, because you're all tied in. You're boxed in. The state has much more flexibility. I know that. And any legislator that tells you that you do have flexibility, they're not being honest, because you don't. I mean, that's just a fact. The other thing I think related to that we can look at that the state has some control over is, and both candidates for governor talked about this, looking at additional resources, is these tax credits and incentive programs we have at the state level. You all generally don't have those. That's a huge number that if we looked at those and found the ones that weren't effective, were no longer producing the economic benefit, that would be additional dollars immediately that the state would have that we could look at, again, related to tax reform, or at least helping to do something like this, or funding some of the other priorities from a local government standpoint that can help you all so that you have more flexibility to be able to deal with some of these other issues. So I think one way we can help you is look at this issue, see what we might be able to accomplish, get on the same page with that, and then look for ways that can provide you all additional flexibility from the standpoint of whether it's tax policy, whether we can come up with additional resources that have them come your way, to provide that additional flexibility, and do that. But as you all know, part of the problem with local budgets is the education budget just consumes almost everything. And one of the discussions I think we all need to have is, how are we spending education dollars? I've got an 11-year-old, he's in middle school. I want our education system to be a great one. But, do we need to spend $40 million on a school? I mean, those are the kind of discussions I think you all and we need to have, and try to help our school systems be as efficient as they can so that they can provide the instructional benefit for kids, but help you all so that it's efficiently done, so that you all don't have to just spend money year after year after year on things sometimes that may not make the difference. And I'm not saying teacher salaries, because we all know that personnel is the main thing for our school system. That's what works the best. So I think there's some strategies and things that we can do working together to provide you all that flexibility. And this is one of them.
I want to thank each and every one of you for being here today and participating, and I most especially want to thank Delegate Landis and Joe Casey for taking their time to be here for their presentation.